recording here. Sorry, I'm recording here. So welcome to Sefer Beresheet, Perashat Beresheet. This is where all the good stuff happens. Everything stems from here, literally everything in the universe and everything in the Sefarim that we are going to learn henceforth. So today I'd like to thank Carol and Maurice Silvera and Joyce Hadaya for dedicating this class in memory of their father, Leilui Nishmat Isaac ben Esther. Thank you. And also, I would like to dedicate our learning today to the Refuah Shelema of Leah Bat Yitel. May she have a fast and full recovery. And if anybody at any point wants to sponsor any of the classes, you can call Jessica. Maybe she can post her number in the chat, or Vivien Hidary through the SEA, or through Safra, or even through Torah. You can text me directly and I can direct you to any of them. So let's get straight into the Bereshit story. If you have Chumashim, bravo for you. If you don't have Chumashim, I strongly suggest that now is a great time, since we're first starting the whole Sefer, that you get your own Chumashim and start to take notes in them. This is going to be the Sefer Torah that you write. This will be your own personal Sefer Torah. And the sooner you do it, the better, because you'll have years, God willing, till 120 to keep referring back to notes and ideas that you've had previously, and just keep compounding on your learning. So for today, we're going to start with the first verse, the first pasuk. I think there's so much contained in that first pasuk. It's comprised of 7 words. As we've said often, 7 is a cycle. And everything in the physical world moving forward from this first pasuk of Bereshit is going to be honored by this first verse. The first verse, I'll read it for you, is Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. These 7 words are going to lay the foundation for our entire universe and for the world as we know it, and for existence with a capital E as we know it. So the simplest reading of this would seem to say, if you wanted Bereshit to express the words in the beginning, then we would say, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And that is a very formative and informative verse, because it doesn't just tell us that God is the creator of the heavens and the earth. It doesn't just tell us that God created first the heavens, then the earth in this verse. It tells us something that we, as students of text that have been learning in this way, could start to understand in a much more profound way. It's saying, you know, the system that we use when we go and see how a word is used in other places in text. The Torah itself is going to choose its first word, the word Bereshit, so that we can do the exercise and ask ourselves, where else do we see this particular word Bereshit? Where else does it appear, so that I could understand what God is referring to when he starts his sefer, his gift to humanity, with this word. And it's very exciting. I myself had never looked up the word Bereshit, but sure enough, I looked it up last night, and it only appears 4 other places in all of Tanakh. And do you know where it appears? It appears in the book of Yirmiyahu. You have to go pretty far and deep to find it. But that's not what I wanted to present to you today. I wanted to present that every time we see this word Bereshit appear in Tanakh, the other 4 times that it appears, it is always referencing malchut, kingship. It talks about, you don't have the word Bereshit without the word malchut in those 4 other places, meaning kingship, meaning that what God is creating here is kingship, but way more profound than introducing us to his kingship and his dominion of the heavens and of the earth. This Sefer was given to us, to Ben Adam, because it's ultimately going to be a story of our kingship, of how we could be literally in God's image. As we're going to see soon, that is God's purpose for creating us. And so with that introduction, that the word Bereshit in text always refers to crowning and reigning kings. This is God's way of crowning and reigning humanity. It's also saying that within the reign, or within the ability to wear the crown that he is going to bestow upon us, we must be aware that there are and there exists from the beginning of creation 2 levels of realities. There is the Shamayim and there is the Aretz. What that means is, if we want to start by saying that every person is a universe, then every person has 2 levels of realities. We have our physical reality and we have our spiritual reality. Or if you just wanted to take it even in a simpler way, within each person, inside the way he created us, physiologically, we have, and we've discussed these terms before, we have the upper brain, we have the lower brain. We have our own internal shamayim, we have our own internal audits. And how it is that we're ultimately going to be able to be these people of Bereshit. I'm talking about all humanity right now. How we're going to be able to be a people that is crowned and that has a sense of kingship is ultimately going to be able to balance these 2 entities. We're going to have to discuss a little more what it means to balance Shamayim with Aretz. And God's going to give us the instruction. The whole Sefer is very, very generous. So I strongly urge you to read the Perashat in its entirety. Unfortunately, for the scope of today's class, I need to be skipping over a couple of areas so that I can bring you to certain spaces. But I would like for you to know that the 7 days of creation are in themselves formative, not just of the world, but of each human being, each embryo and each person. When we get to the actual formation of man, which appears in chapter 1, verse 26, Hashem, and I should say Elohim, says this verse. It's a very controversial, very much written about verse. Na'aseh Adam betzalmenu kidmutenu. Let us make man in our image, in our form or likeness. V'yirdu bidgat haaretz. And they're going to go down, or they're going to rule over. Red, lech, red is a great word because it has multiple definitions. One means to descend, and one means to rule over. And it's not by accident that this is the very word that was used for humanity. The very same word that tells us to go down tells us to rise up. The same word that says descend says ascend, sit on the throne. So these words I want to show you as they start to unfold. I believe Sefer Beresheet is the blueprint for us to really attain the greatness that God intended for us from the very beginning. So reading Sefer Bereshit should be an ideal for us, and it should be very energizing for us. I want to read for you the rest of the pasuk. So v'yirdu bidgat hayam. So let them either go down all the way to the bottom of existence, of the lowest point that we could imagine in our physical space is all the way to the bottom of the ocean. If we had to draw an axis in our world from the lowest to the highest, we would start on the bottom of the ocean, and then we would go where? To the off hashamayim. We would go all the way up to the heavens. And all of a sudden we have again this imagery. We're going from Aretz to Shamayim. I know I do this a lot, and we're going to see the pasuk hopefully if there's time for it today. But even in the creating of the world, from Shamayim to Aretz, in the first verse, when man is going to be created, God's going to give him this ability to start to rule from the bottom up, from all the way from the bottom of the ocean to all the way the fowl or the birds in the skies, and the behemah, and everything in between. So if you had to consider the sandwich, you'd say the bottom was the ocean and the top was the sky, and everything in between, the behemah, and everything that swarms on the land. This was God's plan. God's plan was not that the Shamayim LaHashem, and just the Aretz Natan Livnei Adam. God's plan was for us to be like him in his image, in his likeness, in his form, meaning if God's domain spans from the bottom of the ocean to the top of the heavens, so too when man was created, the intent was for us to be able to balance ourselves. I say very often with Jacob's ladder, our feet on the ground and our head in the clouds. I want to take it one further. I want you to have your feet literally on the bedrock, on the bottom of the ocean, and your head in the highest heavens. That was the original intent that God had for man. And so the next verse says, Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam. God creates the man, creates humanity. The word for Adam here is not just Adam, because we have Adam and we have Eve. This is not just Adam. This is not just Adam that's being created. This is all of humanity, because you're going to see that it's Zachar unekeva bara otam. So when Elohim is going to create humanity, he's going to create humanity in his image. And then my favorite verse this is, because it's one, or if not the first chiastic structure that you'll see in Sefer Bereshit, so telling. It's, I think, the parent of all chiastic structures, of all mirror image structures. Meaning, let me finish the verse the second. I'm too excited. There's so many things happening, and it's exciting because it's the birth of humanity. How could we not get excited? But it's really more exciting when we go back to the basics and we realize the DNA that God infused in us. So, Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam betzalmo. Elohim creates man in his own tselem. A tselem is, sometimes you could use the word to say shadow, but we're going to see it's going to mean much more than that. It says, Betselem Elohim bara oto. In his shadow, or in his image, or in his likeness, he created him. Zachar unekeva bara otam. He created them male and female. So according to many of the commentaries, the first version of the creation of Adam was that they were an androgynous being, that he created them together, and later on when he put Adam to sleep, he separated Chava and they became two separate beings. But for our purposes today, when it says words like Vayivra Elohim Betzalmo in the first part of the pasuk, and then it says Betselem Elohim bara, those words are literally reflecting each other. They're looking at each other in the mirror. And the reason, and I'm hoping that this is a review for some of us, and if it's news to some of us, that's even more exciting, because Torah and creation is literally all packed in this one verse. How God created us and what his intent was is embedded in this verse. Because the way we have Vayivra Elohim Tzalmo, and then we have Tselem Elohim Bara, we say those words are looking in a mirror. It's as if the words are reflecting each other. And so if God created us to reflect him, this is the exciting part of it. Yes, he created us in his image, but the part that is recorded here that sometimes seems so scary is that we're not just the image in the mirror that reacts to the subject that's outside of the mirror. What God creates, when God creates, is that this is a two-way mirror, that the mirror reacts to the subject and the subject reacts to the mirror. It sounds very scary. It may sound even a little fairy tale-esque, where the mirror starts talking back. You ever see Mary Poppins, where her image starts speaking back to her? It's something we're not familiar with, because in the physical world, the subject controls the image in the mirror. But in Torah, in God's creation, in the creation of Shamayim and Aretz, where they're going to reflect each other, both sides are subjects and both sides have the ability to impact the actions of the other side. Maybe it doesn't sound so practically stated, so I'll state it in this way. This idea of being created, B'Tselem Elohim, we hear this word, these terms very often. To be created B'Tselem Elohim doesn't mean just to be created in God's shadow. It means that God is infusing us with this ability to have a dynamic relationship with him. A relationship where he too responds to us, and it's not just we who have to respond to his whims. This idea of Shamayim and Aretz, this first verse is impressing upon us, is begging us to recognize God is our creator, and he created us to be majestic. He created us to be kings. He created us to be creators. And the next verse is going to support the statement. It's a little scary to think of humanity in this way, but it's right here, verse 28, chapter 1, Bereshit. Vayvarech otam Elohim. Elohim blesses them. Vayomer lahem Elohim. Elohim says to them, and the Vayomer means it is immutable. What he's saying is not changeable. And these words, they may sound familiar. I'd like to revisit them for today. Peru, urvu, umil'u et haaretz vekivshuha. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, conquer her. Uredu bidgat hayam. Here we go again. Go either down or rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, and all of the animals and everything that's swarming on the land. In case we weren't sure if there was anything between the point where God intended his intent, which was Na'aseh Adam, let us make man, and his actualization. Sometimes you start to write a story, and then by the time you're in the middle of it, you end up in a different direction, or you start a painting, or you start a project, and whatever it is in the middle, the original vision isn't always the end result. Here, the original vision is right here. He's blessing them so that they could accomplish his original vision for them. And then he says to them, Hine natati lachem, I give you, I bequeath to you, not just the things that are living that have a soul like fish or birds or animals, not just the animal kingdom. I give to you as well the vegetation world. I give you the esev, the zoreya zera, that's on all of the face of the earth. I give you the trees. I give you the fruits. I give you all seeds. I give you all of that for you to consume. And so rather than get into a whole vegetarian conversation or anything of the such that we've had in the past, I'd like for today for us to recognize that what is God telling us when he gives us this charge, when he says, Peru urvu umil'u et ha'aretz vekivshuha. He's saying that, first of all, Peru, I want you to be fruitful. I want you to multiply, but more specifically, Peru, like perot, I'm giving you vegetation. I am allowing you, or I am encouraging you, perhaps, to be farmers. Hold those thoughts for a minute, because we're going to meet a farmer very soon. And in order for you to produce, to be Peru Urvu, to produce much vegetation, I know Peru Urvu is also used most often to describe having children. Peri Batin, the fruits of our wombs, means to be fruitful and multiply. But we could have just said Revu. The Peru part, this idea that the child that you're bringing is a fruit, where you are its tree, has tremendous ramifications to it. But as we move on, it says the words, Peru urvu umil'u et haaretz vekivshuha. You also need to have, so the understanding, if we want to go back to Shamayim and Aretz, is yes, I want you to have the deepest of the deep. I want you to be in control of the highest of the high. And when you're in the middle plane, I want you yourself to be fruitful, and I want you also to bring about vegetation and fruits, and I want you to be in control of the animals as well. And then sure enough, after we hear this whole story, we have the episode of the Adam and Chava and the tree that they were not allowed to eat from. What is going on here? There are two main stories and possibly a third of sin, where Adam and Chava don't obey God's rule, and then Cain ultimately kills his brother Hevel. We went from the first verse of excitement, of introduction of existence of humanity and all of its ideals, and within the same parasha, we have these tremendous falls from greatness. So much so that Adam and Chava are, what's that word called? Are evicted from Gan Eden. It's a very hard and harsh story to read. This whole idea that we and God are partners and that we could rise to the highest heights is all recorded here with the same story of man's fall. And his fall is a hard one and is a harsh one, and ultimately calls for his eviction. So what is the Torah telling us? It's saying this beautiful melody that's being described here, this beautiful song where we're going to stand on the bottom and we're going to reach the top, and we're going to achieve this balance and this axis of verticality where we're going to at the same time be so physical, at the same time be so spiritual, and be able to literally find a middle point where we're also able to be in the land of the animals and the mammals. That's not something that is so easily achieved. The first man who was created by God's hands, that God formed and that God fashioned, is going to have trouble with this. It's a level of verticality that's almost impossible for first man and woman. And so we need to read their stories, and we need to understand, what is it that we today, we are not fashioned directly as they were, directly like a potter with his clay. We were formed for sure with a breath of God's air into us. Our neshama comes from there. But ultimately, what the Torah wants to teach us is, and that's what the whole Sefer Torah moving forward is going to be. There's going to be a difference between nafal and between lakum. And that's what we're going to be doing constantly, between falling and rising. There's going to be a dynamic, constant movement within humanity that's going to, they use the words, I'll just cite them because I think they're very fantastical characters that don't get enough attention. The Nephilim that hayu ba'aretz. At the end of Perashat Beresheet, they introduce us to these Nephilim. We think that they are the sons of the Anakim, of the giants. And there are so many midrashim surrounding them. We don't know what to do with this word Nephilim. They are the fallen ones. They are the ones that, according to a midrash, were wearing the sun around their necks. So you could imagine the imagery that the Mefarshim wanted us to have. They were so tall that if you tried to look at their heads, you couldn't see their head. You could only see the sun because their head was even above the sun. So it looked like the sun was a necklace around their necks. These are the fantastical images that the Torah is giving us, but it's not giving it to us so that we should crumple up and give up. It's giving us the extremes, and it's telling us at the same time, the Nephilim, the very beings who were so tall that their heads were above the sun, that wore the sun around their necks, their name are Nephilim. They are the fallen ones. They can't maintain a level of verticality. It becomes monstrous to the point if the level of verticality that they achieve doesn't have a level of being grounded at the same time. So this balance is what the Torah is going to try, and every story from here through Devarim, through the end of the Tanakh, is all about one thing. It's all going to be about achieving this sense of balance. As a matter of fact, the Nephilim, we should take 1 second just to look at it, because it just proves the point that everything that is subsequent to Perashat Beresheet really has its foundations in Sefer Beresheet. So if you'll allow me to indulge for 1 minute, if you go to Sefer Bemidbar, if you're working off of the Stone Edition, it is on page 802. It speaks of the Nephilim, the very same Nephilim, either the fallen ones or the giants. We'll see how it refers to them here. It's chapter, it starts at the end of chapter 13 in Sefer Bemidbar. That last verse says, it's the spies come back with a report of the land of Israel. And what do they say? Actually, let's go to verse 32 for a second. Right? They spoke about the land that they had gone to tour, and they said that this land is a land that eats its inhabitants, which is a complete inversion of what we saw in Sefer Beresheet, where the inhabitants are the ones that eat the land. And then it says all of the people that we saw there were anshe midot. They were people of measure. And there is where we saw the Nephilim. They are the sons of the giant, giants of the Nephilim, of these either fallen ones or these very, very big, tall ones. And we were in our own eyes as grasshoppers, and so too we were in their own eyes. And we've learned this very often, and we said it's all about our perception. If we see the Nephilim as these great giants, we may see ourselves as grasshoppers. And the problem with the spies that came home with the negative report was that they didn't see their totality. They only saw their sheretz like. They only saw that they were the swarmers of the earth. They didn't remember the first verse in Sefer Beresheet, that they were entire universes that contained heaven and earth. They only saw that they were the little insects within the earth. And what happens when this perspective rears its ugly head? Every word that we're going to find after that, we're going to see everybody is going to be like the Nephilim. It's a play on words. Vayipolu. Everybody is going to end up falling down. And this is a problem. The idea here, it says, verse 3, why did God bring us to this land? Lin pol bacherev. There's a self-fulfilling prophecy that comes from the fear of recognizing our own greatness or our own verticality. What I mean by that is, if this generation couldn't, at this point, we're already, for goodness sakes, in Sefer Bemidbar, and I'm not speaking about them. I am, but I'm speaking about us as well. This is recorded here because this is the nature of humanity. It's scary, they say it's lonely at the top. It's sometimes scary to look in that mirror and see our own greatness. Because when we do, and if we do recognize the verticality that we've been bestowed with, it may scare us. And here, by not recognizing it, I'll just tell you, it doesn't keep us neutral. We cannot look in the mirror and see neutral. Because if we don't see our greatness, we're destined to fall, linpol, and everybody falls. Moshe falls on his face in verse 5, and over, everybody across the board, their carcasses are going to fall in the desert, and one verse after the next, we're going to see this falling problem that's going to come. So we don't want to be fallers. We don't even want to spend any more time talking about falling. We want to talk about the idea of how are we going to be these people who are able to lakum, who are able to stand upright in the presence of God. And so I'd like to take us and go together to the story of Cain and Hevel. I always believe there are a lot of secrets embedded in that story. It's page 20 in the Stone Edition. Chapter 4, Sefer Beresheet. And right away, if we want to just hop into the Vayiplu Panav words, we could. This idea, and I may need to start from the beginning, this idea of the story of Cain and Hevel, yes, it is the first occurrence of a brother murdering his brother, fratricide. And there is a lot to be learned from how humanity interacts. But I think there are even more levels to be understood from this Cain and Hevel exchange. If we start at the beginning, and I want to thank Judy Schwartz, she sent me a piece on Rav Amnon Bazak. I had never noticed this, but he pointed out two very interesting points. I'll share them both. The first one is how Cain and Hevel's name in the text comes about in chiastic form, meaning the first one to be introduced is Cain, and then comes Hevel, and then Hevel is a etzon, and Cain is a farmer. You have Cain, Hevel, Hevel, Cain. And then in the next few verses, they talk about Cain, then Hevel, then Hevel, then Cain. And again, I can't impress upon us enough. These are the tools that the text has for us to understand this mirror imaging. And maybe I'll come up with a better way to formulate what I mean by that. But the idea of cause and effect, the idea of action and reaction is clearly stated in all of these stories. It's the ability that we may have to see them and recognize them that's going to be part of our greatest challenge. So that was one of the things that Rav Amnon brought out. And the second one that I thought was also fantastic was that I'm going with the hope that you know the story of Cain and Abel, where Cain brings a gift. It's not accepted. Hevel's gift is accepted. And Cain ultimately, to give you the cliff notes, kills his brother. But there's a lot that goes on there, and there's a lot of psychology behind it. And one of them is that Cain was the older brother, and he had a sense of entitlement. And he was born with this idea that Chava says, Kaniti ish, this child, you want to meet my son Cain? You know who his father is? Kaniti ish et ha-Elohim. I acquired him together with God. God was a partner in this child's birth. And this is my other son, Hevel. I don't even have a reason for his name. He's just Hevel. Hevel is Hevel, like that. That's how he's described. And so what happens is Cain grows up with all of these entitlements. He thinks he's the godchild. He thinks he has everything coming to him. And the fact that he's a farmer is very telling as well. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. God created farmers and shepherds. Those were the earliest two professions, farmers and shepherds. And we're going to see what happens in our story, that the farmer, who is Cain, the one who brings the fruits, and I know there are some commentaries that say that they weren't the greatest fruits. I don't even know that that was the issue. I prefer the understanding that Hevel hevi gam hu, that Hevel also brought, meant that Hevel brought himself. He brought of himself. He understood what it meant to stand in the presence of God. And if this story is anything, it's about how do we achieve a vertical stance? How are we able to lakum, to stand in front of God? Because when we're able to stand in front of God, then we're standing in a position for God to place that crown upon our heads. And that's what this is Bereshit is going to be all about. So if we want to learn a little more and understand why this story is even recorded here, I believe that the words where it says in verse 5, for instance, Ve'el Cain ve'el minchato lo sha'a. Not Cain and not his gift did God want. That's a story in and of itself. The prophets have been saying, do you think God needs your korbanot, your sacrifices? Do you think that God needs those sacrifices? That's not what he needs. He needs for you to be upright. He needs for you to hear his word, to heed his law. And so here, right here, in the very beginning, since the earliest of creation, God is telling not just Cain, he's telling us as well. If you want to be able to stand in my presence, then this is what Hevel did was right, and what Cain did was not. What did Hevel do that was so fantastic? That's what we have to ask ourselves. I like to say Hevel hevi gam hu. He brought of himself, and he brought from the bechorot of his son, which is very interesting. He himself wasn't the bechor, but he recognized the value and the importance and the reverence given to the bechor. It's not so easy for the guy who isn't the Bechor to give the institution of Bechorah, of firstborn, as much respect. But he did. The non-Bechor is going to bring from his Bechorot, and that's why it doesn't say that God accepts his offering. It says he accepts him. If God is accepting of him, then by extension, he's going to accept his offering. And Cain and his mincha, have a nice day. Lo sha'ah, not interested. Vayichar leCain me'od, and Cain is miserable. And here we have the words we were looking for. Vayiplu panav, he becomes fallen. His face falls. There is this collapse that's taking place. There's a visual of somebody that is descending. Either his face falls, his head falls, he himself falls. And God asks him, and he says, Lama charalach, why are you so miserable? And lama naflu panecha, why are you not in a state of verticality in all of its glory? Halo im tetiv, don't you know that if you do tov, se'et. This is Rav. Thank you, Judy. I enjoyed the class a lot. This is Rav Amnon. I thought it was a beautiful take on it. He says, im tetiv se'et. What does se'et mean? I always thought it means to be uplifted, to lift your face. Yisah Hashem panav elecha. God's going to lift up your face. But he added a beautiful wrinkle. He said, se'et, from the words, from the meaning firstborn. Cain, you are the firstborn, like Reuven. Kochi Beresheet oni, yeter se'et veyeter az. Reuven is the se'et, is the oldest, is the firstborn. He's telling Cain, you can still be in first place. You can still hold the title of firstborn. Maybe you feel because I accepted Hevel's offering and not yours, and this is a very big human issue. We think, and this is bad, but we limit God's ability to hand out gifts and blessings and awards. We think that because God accepted Hevel, then it means that he didn't accept me. My mother always says the sun shines for everybody. God has enough greatness and has enough radiating of goodness that the entire world can have blessing. Just because the other one is blessed, it doesn't mean that I can't also be blessed. And this is what God, these are the words of God. Halo im tetiv se'et. I think he's speaking to every one of us when he tells this to us. If you do good, im tetiv, if you will do tov, se'et, not only will you be like Cain, back in God's graces of being the firstborn, but you will be in a national way. I think this is God speaking to us individually, but also nationally. We need to hear these words today more than ever. Halo im tetiv se'et. Don't you know that B'ni Bechori Yisrael, B'nai Yisrael, you're also my Bechor. And if you can learn and do Tov, then you will stay in that position of the Bechor. The Bechor is the one who wears the crown. The Bechor is synonymous with the vertical one, the one who's able to go from Aretz to Shamayim, the one who's able to balance all of this. And so when God tells him this, he says, Ve'im lo tetiv. And this is the problem with the way humanity, not the problem, this is the reality of humanity. It's not that you can just say, I choose not to do Tov, I'm going to coast. There's no coasting. Im tetiv se'et. You do Tov, you're the Bechor, you're vertical, you're upright, you wear the crown. But im lo tetiv, there's two options. tov, and not tov. Anything in between, if you're not going to be ki tov, you're not going to recognize the tov inside of you. There's so many play on words. God creates the world, and with every part of creation, he sees the world and he says, ki tov, this is good. If we can't see the ki tov within ourselves, then we're going to be what? We're going to end up falling, because im lo tetiv, if you're not going to see your goodness, if you're not going to activate your goodness, if you're not going to recognize your goodness, if you're not going to take your tov, lepetach hatat rovetz, there is a petach, you're giving an opening, you're creating a void where chet could be literally, they animate the institution of sin, of chatat, and they give it a living, animated verb, rovetz. Its sin is crouching at the door. If you're not going to show life, if you're not going to live your life with your essence of tov, you're giving your life force to chet. You're actually taking something inanimate like sin and giving it force and giving it life. That force is going somewhere. It's an energy that Hashem gave us of tov. If you're not going to use it, it's not going to be unused. It's not going to stay neutral. It's going to go into a worse place. Ve'elecha teshukato, they take this thing called sin and they say it's lusting after you, it's craving you. But ultimately, and this is my favorite, if you ever need 3 words to pick you up on a tough day, hang on to these 3 words and hang on to them literally for life. Ve'ata timshol bo. I don't care what those urges are, what those forces are, what the negative side is. I don't care how strong the magnetic pull could possibly be, says God. Ultimately, the way that I created you is ata timshol bo. You have the ability to rule over where your energies are placed and how you see yourself. And if you're able to see your shamayim, if you're able to see the spirituality within your physical part. And then ultimately, unfortunately, vayakom kayin, the very word that we thought we were searching for, this idea of lakum, this idea to stand up, to stand in your place, to stand before God. He stands up, but what does he do with his stance, with his vertical stance? He kills his brother. And when we get to this idea of Cain killing Hevel, we come upon this word of Anochi. He asks him, what did you do? Where is asked him, where is Hevel, your brother? And Cain answers and says, Lo yadati. I don't know. I didn't eat from Etz Hada'at. I'm not a person of knowledge. I am not knowledgeable. And by the way, Hashomer achi anochi, there's many ways to play with it. One is, Hashomer achi, my brother's keeper should be you, should be anochi. Or I didn't know I'm in charge of my brother. And these words are going to reverberate throughout the entire Sefer. Yes. Are you your brother's keeper? The answer is going to be yes every time. Whether it's Yaakov and Esav or Yosef and his brothers, whether it's Moshe and Aharon, whoever these brothers may be, Ephraim and Menashe, pick your set of brothers. Yes, you are their shomer. And I'd like to, since we're playing with the word Anochi, I wouldn't mind if we took 1 minute, because I think this is also a big part of what Sefer Beresheet offers us, is when Adam and Chava eat from this tree, and they from what they shouldn't have. Chapter 3, verse 10. God comes and he asks him, and he says, Ayeka, where are you? because we know that Adam and his wife were hiding betoch ha'etz. One day I'd like to explore that, because the etz that was betoch was actually the tree of life, and I was playing with the idea that perhaps they were hiding inside the tree of life, because they knew that had they eaten from the fruits of the tree of knowledge, that they would die. And so by going inside the tree of life, they thought that that would protect them and give them life. It's a story to play with maybe next time. But God calls to Adam and he asks him, Ayeka, and Adam answers him and says, I heard your voice in the garden, and Anochi ve'iraki erum Anochi va'echabe. He's the first person. Adam, surprisingly, is the first person who uses this term, the usage of the word Anochi. Every subsequent time that we're going to see this word Anochi, we're going to have to bring it back to this Adam's Anochi. What is Adam stating? I went and made a list because I had nothing better to do, and I made a list in Torah of all the people who have invoked this term Anochi. And besides Hashem, of course, who invokes it many times, but invokes it most famously at the 10 Commandments, we have Adam and Cain, Abraham and Sarah, Lot, Avimelech. We have the Eved of Abraham. We have Rivka, Lavan, Esav, Yaakov, Leah, Rachel, Yosef, Yehuda, and Tamar. All use this term Anochi. And we have to really ask ourselves, what does Anochi mean? Is Anochi in some way, Anochi just because it's hard for me to give an English term. So for those of you who don't know what Anochi means, I'm going to try to the best of my ability to say that Anochi is a phrase that we use to describe ourselves. And we usually use this term Anochi when we have some type of existential moment where we have to describe ourselves either to ourselves or describe ourselves to others, or describe ourselves to God, or have God describe himself to us. But ultimately, Anochi is asking us to look into ourselves and our divinity, and to what extent we are able, with this Anochi, with this divinity, to be able to stand in this, in the two realms, in the physical and the spiritual realm. And this, a lot of this, I'll just say that Anochi, of course, somebody asked, is it positive or a negative? It's usually used in the positive, but very often it's a crisis. Lama ze anochi? Why am I? What is my existence? But I would like to say that if you're in the business of asking the question, if you're just in the business of asking, what am I doing here? Why am I here? What does God want from me? My response would be, you're already on the path to something that's positive, to something that's building. You're already on your way to trying to find a foundation from which we could lakum, from which we could get up. And it's interesting because with Adam's Anochi, we could even go further back. We could say everything we're going to see here in Sefer Beresheet, whether it is the Nachash, for instance. We know that Moshe's career, his profession starts with God introducing a Nachash to Moshe. We have to ask ourselves the question, what's Adam's Nachash doing in Moshe's world? Why would God bring the Nachash out of retirement, so to speak? We've finished from the Nachash. What do we need him for? No, says God, I'm going to bring him out of retirement and bring him into the Moshe story, because I want to tell you that this, what you're seeing here in Bereshit, the way there are at least 3 different creations of the world, the world is in a constant form, in a constant transformative phase of being recreated. And so with Moshe, maybe we'll use him for a minute as an example. With Moshe, when he's creating Moshe, when he's forming Moshe, when he's molding Moshe to literally be in his image, Moshe is going to be God's representative to humanity, just the way Adam was. So when God starts to fold and mold Moshe, it's interesting. If you think about the 3 signs that God gives Moshe, he is telling him what we're learning here now in Sefer Bereshit. He tells him, throw your stick, throw something that's dead. A stick is a piece of wood that no longer has life in it. So you can take your stick, throw it on the floor, and it'll become a nachash. You could actually look at it this way. Take something that's vertical, throw it on the floor, now it becomes horizontal. Take something that's dead, throw it on the floor, and now it becomes living. How about this? Every one of the 3 signs that he gives Moshe, he tells Moshe they involve Moshe's hands. Why did they involve Moshe's hands? Because Moshe, the way I used my hands to create Adam, I want you to understand the value and the power that you hold in your own hands. You hold in your hands the ability to take the vertical and make it horizontal, to take the dead and bring it to life. And back to our chiastic structure, you have the ability to do the reverse or the inverse. Because after you take your stick and you throw it and turn it into a nachash, you also have the ability to hold on to the tail of the snake and turn it back into a mateh. And the next sign that God gives Moshe is just an easy segue. You can take that same hand that controls life and death and put it in your chest, put it in live, clean, healthy skin, and bring it out with sara'at, kishalig, like snow. We know that sara'at is like a kemet, is like a dead person. Your hand could go from life to death and back to life again. This is Jewish existence. Just when you think that Jewish life as you know it is over and done with, it's in your hand literally to take the situation and bring it back to life. I can't stress enough the state of Israel. We were done for from the ashes. It was over, and God brought our nation and our statehood back to life. Even the third, if you want to call it a sign that he gave Moshe, which is all back to the same stories in Bereshit. What does Cain do? He spills his brother's blood on the ground. What is Moshe's third sign? Take water and spill it on the ground. Take life and bring it literally to death, and all of the opposites that have to do with it. Water represents life, blood represents death, water versus dry land, bayabeshet, on the yabasha. All of these opposites, Moshe. I'm creating you and I'm creating humanity who reads the Torah after you to understand clearly that what we all possess are these abilities to bring Shamayim down to Aretz, bring Aretz down to Shamayim, bring that which is no longer alive back to life. And Moshe does it. Who's going to take a people, for goodness sakes, a people that has been enslaved for thousands of years and put crowns on their heads? How on earth does that happen? And so what God is asking us in the book of Bereshit is to be aware of the levels of consciousness that we have. is to be aware that, like with Moshe, the first step to redemption, the first step to our own self-awareness or our own self-redemption is that we are the ones who have the ability to create and recreate ourselves through the anochis that we assume. If we assume anochi lo yadati, I don't know, I didn't know, what do I know? Then you're going to be a person that's not going to have access to the tree of da'at, that you're going to be evicted, and you're going to live your life based on the way that you choose to see your anochi, to see your own self. And when God gave us the Torah, since we're with Moshe, and I'll end with this, everything was shaking. The ground was shaking. The mountains were shaking. And what God is saying with his Anochi, when he brings out his definition and description of himself as Anochi Hashem Elohecha, when he describes his Anochi, there is a sense of trembling. And often we say, oh, we were so scared and we were trembling. But I think what God was doing for us, and this is my humble opinion, is he was showing us that in order to be the ideal Anochi, there's going to be a sense of trembling, a sense of movement. It's not going to be that there are going to be vibrations, there's going to be tensions, there's going to be counter tensions. There's going to be this idea that in order to be an upstanding Anochi, a person who's literally going to balance, whether it's their upper and lower brain or whether it's their physicality and their spirituality. If you ever take a yoga class and you try to stand in tree pose and you're shaking this way and moving that way, the idea is not that we just stand still, because if we just stand still, like the skyscrapers, in order for them not to fall, what has to happen? They're built, some of them even on wheels, they're built with the ability to sway. Because if you're just rigid and you don't allow for any flexibility or movement in your life and you just stay rigid, those things are going to crack and fall. But like the palm trees that are able to sway, or like the skyscrapers that are able to move and not crack and weather the storms, to stand upright in front of God, we need to tremble, we need to move, we need to be fluid, and we need to recognize that every day, by doing this, by balancing ourselves, we're just going to get better at it, and we're just going to be stronger with it, and we're going to achieve that level of malchut. And we're going to achieve what God says, Yehi Or. We're going to rid our world of the darkness. And we're going to recreate our world like he did, by bringing light, by bringing knowledge, by bringing hope, and by bringing belief in our greatest anochis and our greatest force that we were created with in God's image. And we're going to move forward with this idea that God is very often the subject in the mirror, but we too are very often the subject. We too have the ability to bring about change and bring about healing. And I hope and pray that this will be a beautiful year of learning for all of us, of strength, of health, and of faith and verticality that allows us to stand strong and healthy, and ultimately regain the crowns that God has fashioned for every single one of us. Thank you all for joining. It's a pleasure to be learning together, and have a great day. You can unmute yourselves if you want to talk to each other or see your friends now that we're not getting out as much as we'd like. Let me see, I think I could unmute you. Hold on, participants. Unmute. Here you go. Okay, you're unmuted.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vivien.
Thank you. Yashikoa.
Thank you,
Yashikoa was
Vivien.
beautiful.
Thank you.
Amazing.
It was beautiful.
I
I
love
missed
seeing
it.
the
I
gorgeous
missed a little
faces.
bit at the beginning. If anybody